Matt, let's talk fantasy football. Good to have you on again.
Thanks for having me on, Greg. That's what I'm doing all week, so I'm ready to talk fantasy whenever.
Yeah, I know talking football all the time, fantasy, whatever is awesome. I do enjoy though the break that I get to talk a little bit about like NASCAR or horse racing. It just helps to have a little bit of a break. But if you had to just pick one sport that all you talked about was that sport, you can't beat it, huh?
Especially like the once a week nature of the game, so we get just that little respite to actually take in whatever just happened and project forward to what happens next. I don't know how baseball guys do it, honestly.
Yeah, when you because I was into baseball for a while. Matter of fact, it's only been the last couple of years that I can't watch it. But I was a Montreal Expos Washington National fan, so I had my World Series win just before all the craziness started, and then the craziness started, and it's like coincidentally my team decided to rebuild.
hmm
The whole thing was a mess, and I haven't watched any games at all for like 2 years. And it's
Yeah.
like baseball, then you start to think about it and you're like, man, baseball is just so boring. And I'm glad I hear these rules are coming out with, which I'm so shocked that they're
Uh-huh.
actually going to, the clock and you can't shift and all that. All right, good. I applaud them for getting with it. But yeah,
Uh-huh.
big difference between
I used to be
baseball.
big time into baseball too, though. That was my first sport growing up, and I was a Cubs fan forever and really kind of stopped following it just before they finally got over the hump and won that World
Uh,
Series. Although I was certainly watching when that happened.
sure.
But yeah, it's one of those you just need, it takes so much time to devote to. It's
Dedication,
something that's
yes. The
tough to
minor
get.
leagues. There's
hmm
so many things you've got, especially in fantasy baseball. I mean, do you still do fantasy baseball? I guess not. No, I that's a lot of work. Yeah, that's if you have to be dedicated to be into fantasy
For
baseball. It's
sure.
fun because it definitely keeps you busy during the season. But fantasy football, nothing like it, and it's only been a couple of weeks. So I'm going to ask you some questions based on that, and let's talk about the one team. Let's start on offense. We'll go offense and defense. Give me a team on offense that is would you say would be coming off last week, and we can even say week one. What would be like the breakout team right now offensively that we need to be keeping an eye on?
I'm gonna kind of go Jacksonville for all around, coming off the
Oh,
way that week two went.
I like it.
24-0 win over the Colts. I mean, I know that they've beaten the Colts 8 straight times in
Yeah,
Jacksonville, so we
yeah.
shouldn't be surprised at this point if they win. But 24-0, I never would have guessed on a Jaguars beat down here. And they did it on both sides. Trevor
Both
Lawrence,
sides.
83% completions in that game, 7.8 yards per attempt. Christian Kirk was perfect, caught all 6 of his targets for 78, 2 touchdowns. The backfield's effective. I don't think that they're stars yet, although for fantasy, we definitely need a lot more touches for Travis Etienne. We'll see about that going forward. And then the defense sacked Matt Ryan 5 times, grabbed 3 picks. So I
Shutout.
liked Jacksonville coming into the season. I think that we'll see from here. I'm not saying they're broken out, but they're coming along for sure.
Yeah, this is the test this week because they got to go on the road and they got to play a good football team coming off a loss. That now we're going to find out. And look, nobody says you have to win the football game. We're not expecting them to win the game, even but how will they lose the game? Let's just say
Mhm.
that. Are they going to be competitive until the fourth quarter and then the Chargers are going to just outclass them? Or are they going to surprise everybody and say, "No, we've taken a next step here, man. This isn't the same old Jags." I don't think it's the same old Jags anyway,
Mhm.
but yeah, this is a good opportunity. And what I was looking for an upgrade on my defense, and not that uh, the defense isn't a major deal, but Jacksonville is one of them because of the game that they had. But I'm like, all right, you know what? They're available, but I need to see it at least another week because, like you said, anytime you have like a mismatch of sort of like when Minnesota beat Green Bay week one. I was all over Philadelphia week two for a number of reasons. One was I didn't buy into Minnesota's win because Minnesota always gives Green Bay fits. So that kind of divisional, I've got your number thing you can't just say, "Oh, they turned a corner," because they always do that, even how bad they are. So that doesn't mean anything. Now I want to see, has Jacksonville seriously turned a corner or not in this type of situation, both offensively and defensively. And speaking of offensively at wide receiver, is it clearly still Kirk based on what you've seen? And has anybody stepped up to be the definite number two?
Well, Zay Jones, Marvin Jones are on the field just about the exact same amount of time as Christian Kirk so far. I think it's clearly Kirk as the lead target because that's what they paid him to be this
Yep.
offseason. And then that's how the usage was trending in the preseason. So now that we see it happening in the regular season as well, I'm not saying he's definitely going to be the guy that gets the most every single week, but he's the guy to bet on week to week going forward. And then the Joneses, I think, can kind of go back and forth next to him with Evan Engram also in that mix. We saw him on the field more in week 2. We're seeing lots of 3 receivers plus Evan Engram out there. And I think that's the way that they should go, whether they're trailing or whether they're playing well. And that's what we've seen through the first 2 weeks. We're talking them up now. We have to remember a week before they lost to Washington. So,
Sure.
a team in progress that has some potential good stuff that could come out if they keep going in the right direction.
And that's why, again, beating a team that you've beaten 8 straight times, 9 straight times, whatever, is one thing. Now let's see if you can do it, and especially on the road against a Super Bowl contender. So we'll see what happens in that one. All right. Can you now? I was going to ask you about offense, defense, but we could go both with. Like we just did with Jacksonville offensively or defensively. But if you're out there looking for a defense, the one team that I would keep an eye on would be the Colts because they're available in my league. I'm thinking, but I have stock. I don't really want to drop anybody this week, but I'm like, you know what? I'm going to possibly pick them up next week if they do what I think they could do this week because they get Leonard back and he's such a big difference maker. And they've actually been a pretty good defensive fantasy team the last few years.
They have. This week, of course, they have the Chiefs, so you're not going to want to use them in week 3. After that, though, Tennessee, Denver, Jacksonville, Tennessee, Washington, New England. I think all of those are potentially usable matchups. Denver, I wouldn't have guessed heading into the season that was a matchup to play a defense in, but the way that they've looked so far, that's going to be an offense that doesn't scare you. Anywhere that the Chargers D is available, we just talked up the Jaguars. That's who they play this weekend. I would grab the Chargers defense wherever that's possible because the Jacksonville matchup, which, it could wind up going either way. It's possible the Jags score some points here and it's not a great week for the defense, but I'm starting the Chargers D against them no matter how much I like the Jags. And then beyond that, they've got Houston, Cleveland, Denver, Seattle, then the bye, then Atlanta, then San Francisco. So we could be starting the Chargers defense 7 the next 8 weeks.
There you go.
That would be a whole lot of value if we can stick with the defense for that long, like basically half of the fantasy season.
Yeah, and speaking of the Colts, offensively, you've got to be. Are you worried?
Yeah.
Like, especially with Pittman, Taylor, you can still think, okay, he's going to get going, but you never know when these old quarterbacks are at the end of the line. You never know, and sometimes it can happen like that. And maybe not coincidentally, it could happen when you just finally decided to leave the one team that you've been with the whole career to another team. I could see being worried. I'm not so sure I'd give up, but yeah, does that also mean that if you have, say, Pittman, or let's just talk about some other teams as well, you throw in there, are there any other players that if you have them right now after the first few weeks, but what you've seen that you may go, you know what, maybe I might want to try trading these guys to try and get some value? Is that something that you would consider this early?
Yeah, it is actually. We just happened to put out our first buy, sell, hold report of the season on draftsharks.com this week. And, that's where it does exactly what it says. We pick out some guys that we would buy, pick out some guys we would sell, pick out some guys that we're still kind of waiting to see what happens. Don't really want to be too rash on them right now. So I think I'm kind of less worried about the impact on Pittman than I am on Taylor because I don't think that Matt Ryan's totally shot. I think he might be less than what they were hoping to be. I don't know that he's going to prove to be an improvement over Carson Wentz, but I think that there's so little around Pittman that he's going to get targeted so much that his numbers will be there. And Taylor, it's not panic, but it's like, uh-oh, maybe these Colts are actually worse on offense than last year's. And if that's the case, maybe it cuts into his carry load. The other side of that is they're actually throwing the ball more to Jonathan Taylor now than they were last season. We'll see if that changes. But, ultimately, it's like if you have Jonathan Taylor, it's not time to panic, but it's time to watch and see if things get a little worse than you might have thought. Clyde Edwards-Helaire is one guy that I would look into selling right now because he's given us fantasy numbers so far. He scored a couple times in week 1. He got the yardage in week 2, but the touches really haven't been there. I've been surprised that he didn't get more. It was easy in week 1 to say, yeah, they pulled him early though in this
Yeah,
lopsided game. So we'll see what happens next week. Week 2 came and he basically split receiving work with Jerick McKinnon, which I don't like because I don't think
I
Jerick
know.
McKinnon offers a ton at this point. But I mean, if that's how they're using CEH, that's going to hurt him from being a weekly contributor, weekly guy you can count on. It's going to take more luck the fewer touches he gets. So that's somebody I might see what the market's like on him right now to see if I can sell high since we're still close to those 2 touchdowns from week 1.
It's interesting you brought him up because he's on. I only have one fantasy team this year, and he's on my team. So I did pick up McKinnon as well, drafted him. And Ronald Jones is available in the waiver wire. And I'm like, you know what? I probably should pick him up just in case of an injury and such, even though I still think McKinnon would probably be the guy who gets most of the touches if Edwards-Helaire got hurt. And you obviously have Pacheco as well. Um, but I just, like I said with the other move, I can't make any of those moves. I have too many players that I just want to hold on to right now. So in the long run, though, as you're saying, uh, that is something that now I didn't pick him to be a top guy,
Right.
but yeah, and also wide receiver. Somebody in our league just dropped Valdez Scantling, and I'm like, whoa. But again, I got guy. It's tough when you because I think, and maybe you tell me what you've learned over the years as being an owner of teams. Don't you believe it's always good to, hey, you drafted a team for a reason. After the first week or two, don't go picking up other guys just because they didn't produce 1 week or the second week. It's you got to give them a little bit of time, right? You can't just go, okay, unless there was a player that's dropped that you wanted and targeted. That's different.
Yeah, the key over the first couple weeks, you'll hear a lot right after week 1 of people saying don't overreact, but it's really about balancing between overreacting and underreacting. Because if you could look at picking up Curtis Samuel after week 1 as an overreaction. Oh, he had one big game, so now all of a sudden you love him. But then he went out and had a big
Sure.
week 2 as well. He's led that team in targets each of those games.
Oh yeah,
So
he's legit. Sure. Yeah.
that's a good case of making of looking at a player's usage. If it's somebody like Dontrell Hilliard, who scored twice in week 1 but touched the ball like 5 times,
OJ
that's not
Howard.
something that's getting repeated. Yeah, OJ Howard.
Yeah.
So it's really important to look at the underlying usage, and really especially for guys that aren't producing, because it's very easy to get, to feel defeated if you're sitting there at 0-2 and this guy that you drafted in round 4 or 3 is not delivering for you. If he's getting the ball, if he's on the field and it just hasn't gone his way through 2 games, that's different than if it's Travis Etienne who's getting, 12 or fewer touches each game so far. That's somebody you worry about less than, say, I guess, Elijah Moore, relative to where you drafted him. Elijah
Yeah.
Moore has been on the field more than any other Jets receiver. I wasn't excited about him heading into the season. I thought he was being overdrafted where he was, but if you drafted him, it's too early to say, well, I made a mistake and give up on Elijah Moore just because he didn't put up the numbers for you yet.
Yeah. And I have Elijah Moore.
There you
Now,
go.
he's on my bench, but I have Elijah
That's the way to
Moore.
do it.
Again, that's what I'm saying. I have players on the bench that I don't want to get rid of, but because I was actually thinking about with Michael Gallup coming off the injury, and I'm actually surprised nobody in my league picked him up because they don't have much at wide receiver at Dallas, and Prescott should be back soon. So if you want a guy that you think should produce decent numbers, but the reason why I decided not to drop any of my receivers for him was just the injury situation as well. That because you obviously have to put that into account. How effective is he going to be this season after that injury? You have to have a situation, I believe, where you really don't like one of your players at all, and you're just looking to add something. Then I can see picking up Gallup, but that's something where you have to really think about it because Gallup could be an interesting pickup at this point.
Yeah, he could be, and I think that if there's room to put him on a team, then I would try to. Jerick McKinnon is a good example of somebody who's in a crowded situation where even if things broke right for him, like if Clyde Edwards-Helaire goes down this week, I think he's probably still sharing work with Isaiah Pacheco. Maybe Ronald Jones
Yeah.
works in at that level, so you kind of gauge what the ultimate upside is for that guy if he gets that one thing that boosts the upside. And like Van Jefferson is another one where you could stash him and say he was top 36 at the end of last year, but is wide receiver 35 really a ceiling worth chasing? This is a decision I had to make the other day for one of my teams. I'm like, yeah, Van Jefferson might contribute, but this other guy has a lot more ceiling for me. So I'm okay with dropping Van Jefferson if somebody else picks him up and they get the guy that finishes wide receiver 34 at the end of the year. I'm not really losing a whole lot, even if this 2 week quarterback option that I'm picking up is ultimately not a big help for my team.
And it's interesting too because I mean, who would have thought that you'd have both Valdez Scantling and Sky Moore and Justin Watson. We know why, and we know he's a talented kid, so maybe he's found a home, but now he's hurt. And then you have, and then, like I said, Ronald Jones. That all those guys on the Kansas City Chiefs roster would be available to take up on fantasy, which is in my league. But it's like you understand why. It's not like this is an accident. So out of those players, would it be Valdez Scantling? Would he be the guy that you still have more faith that's going to pick things up?
He is for me. And, it's not that I think it's a guarantee, but I think that his role is going to be more consistent within the Chiefs offense than it was in the Green Bay offense because they're working him a little bit shorter. He didn't deliver in week 2. He did get 7 targets, though. He matched Travis Kelce for the team lead there. Patrick Mahomes said it's going to vary who's getting the ball week to week. So it might be frustrating. In a lot of cases, we'd say, I'd just rather avoid that frustration, but it's Patrick Mahomes receivers. And
Yeah.
if it's Travis Kelce and then everybody else is rotating, I'm willing to get in on that rotation, especially with a guy that I know is capable of winning downfield.
All right. Now, I also wanted to ask your opinion on who the player of the week was. Give us a couple of players, including your player of the week. And this is not again the obvious. Oh, he scored the most points, so he's the player of the week. So give me a guy that just impressed you the most, and maybe even a couple of guys that just missed out on being the player of the week.
Yeah, I mean, there were so many guys that scored a bunch of touchdowns last week. I think Amon-Ra St. Brown is the guy that really stands out just because, I was wary of him heading into the season. Like, what happens now that Hawkinson's back, now that DeAndre Swift's back? Is Amon-Ra St. Brown really that good? Or did he just emerge because they didn't have anything else? It looks like he's apparently that good. I'm willing to admit at this point that I should have drafted more and I wish that I had him on more teams because, everybody's healthy there and he's producing even with a quarterback that's still Jared Goff. So I would call him the player of the week.
Okay.
It's tough to be the player of the week in a week, though, where Tua throws for 469 yards and 6 TDs, and Jalen Waddle and Tyreek Hill do whatever they want. And, the reason they were trailing so much was because Lamar Jackson did whatever he wanted
Yeah.
on the other side of that game. So it's like the player of the week is that game,
Yeah.
if
Right.
we're being fair to
Yeah.
everybody. I also want to throw out one defensive guy. Darius Slay, the corner for Philly, 5 passes defense, 2 interceptions in that game against the Vikings, basically shut down Justin Jefferson in that game, which it's something that we were all, I think, starting to wonder if it was possible. And it turns out it is. Now, it wouldn't make me worry about Justin Jefferson, but I think from a fantasy perspective, we at least look at that upcoming matchup for other clear number 1 receivers against the Eagles and say, all right, I'm not necessarily benching this guy, but maybe I need to look at his upside this week a little bit differently in case Darius Slay is ready to do this even when he's not on the stage of Monday night against Justin Jefferson.
And it just goes to show that maybe Green Bay's defense, their game plan wasn't very smart
Yes,
week
for
one.
sure.
They got a number 1 corner, so it just cracks me up sometimes. I think some of these coaches overthink. Like if you have a number 1 corner, put the number 1 corner on their number 1 receiver. How hard is that? I can do that. You can do that. So no, we're gonna go zone. Let's play zone. Yeah, that always works out.
We're not going to change what we do.
Yeah,
All right.
yeah. That's why Belichick is Belichick because he'll change every week. Okay, let's go now with sleeper of the week, meaning we haven't seen him yet because this is for week 3. So give me a player that you think we should be keeping an eye on Maybe he's available in fantasy waiver wire. Maybe he's stuck on somebody's bench and you notice that and you're like, hey, maybe I should call that guy and ask him for a trade. He doesn't realize that this guy is about to break out. So if you had a few players that we should be keeping an eye on that you think would be that fit that kind of bill, who would that be?
I want to start with somebody who's not necessarily buried because he had a pretty good week one, but AJ Dillon's actually ahead of Aaron Jones so far in expected fantasy points, behind Aaron Jones in actual fantasy points, of course, after Aaron Jones's big week two. But when we talk about expected fantasy points, that's looking at the usage a guy has gotten, how many carries he got, where those carries happen near the goal line, for example, how he's doing in the receiving game. And that's the part that's a little bit surprising for AJ Dillon. Maybe he's doing more of that than a lot of us would have expected. So he's just as involved as Aaron Jones, and even a little bit more so in terms of value so far. And this week is a matchup with the Bucs, which for the past few years, we would look at that and say, well, I'm not playing my running back against them because they're going to stop him. But it doesn't look as tough so far. We're 2 games in, so it's still developing. But through 2 weeks, the Bucs are 15th in run defense DVOA, according to Football Outsiders. They're allowing 4.6 yards per carry to running backs. And it's a different defense up there now. And Ndamukong Suh is gone. Akeem Hicks they signed in the offseason, but he's injured right now. So there's not a whole lot up front besides Vita Vea to say, well, that guy could be a problem for my running back. And with how much Green Bay needs their running backs, I would say feel good about leaning on A.J. Dillon this week. Dameon Pierce could be set up for like a real breakthrough week this week. I don't want to overplay him in fantasy because I don't know what that ceiling is yet. It sure sounds like Lovie Smith really likes him, though. And we get a matchup this week against a Bears team that, to me, doesn't look like it's ready to run up the score on anybody and take the opponent running game out. So I think it's an opportunity for Dameon Pierce to get more work. He got that last week. He was on the field a lot more last week. He ran the ball a little bit more, got more involved as a receiver. So he's getting more touches. I think he's in good shape to get a good number of touches this week. You can play him in fantasy. It's down in this range where if you're looking for a running back, I think he stands out for upside in his range more than I'm, jumping him ahead. I'm not playing him over somebody like Kareem Hunt or
Sure.
CEH that we talked about. I'd probably stick with CEH, although I wouldn't be surprised if Dameon Pierce outscored him. I think a good way to play Pierce this week is on the betting market to bet the over on his rushing line. 54.5 yards was the last one I saw. That number might differ depending on where you look, but we have his rushing projection 13.4 yards over that line at 54.5. So that's a pretty big
Yeah.
margin. I think he's got upside well beyond 68 rushing yards this week. So you can, not risk your fantasy lineup, but also bet on Dameon Pierce this week by playing that rushing over line. Because, if he runs for 70 yards, that's not a big fantasy day, but it's way over what Vegas is projecting for him. One guy on defense, because I am an IDP guy in fantasy, I want to say Jeremiah Owusu-Koramoah could be on the verge of a stat breakout. He has played well so far. His playing time could be a little bit better. It dipped to 77% last week. It was 85% in week one. I would love it to be 100%, but 85 is enough of a level that he can make plays. And he's Pro Football Focus's top graded linebacker out of anybody so far. So if he's playing 85%, he's got that going for him. He's playing Pittsburgh tonight. I know we're recording this before the game. Even if people are watching this after the game, maybe he already broke out. Maybe it sounds like I'm just not really
It'll be posted
going
before
out on a
that.
limb.
That's okay.
But I think that Jeremiah Owusu-Koramoah could really be in for some big numbers the rest of the way.
Okay. By the way, Duggar, he's banged up, and it's one of the reasons why I like Baltimore this week because I remember Duggar was drafted for like that particular role because he was supposed to fit sort of like that joke role. He's supposed to be like that quarterback, especially with Joke. It's obvious because he's in the same division. But with Duggar, that was a big part of it. And I'm like, you know what? If he's banged up, and he's off to a nice start too. And I was like, if he's banged up, that's probably not good for the Patriots. And I got a bunch of other problems as it is.
Mm-hmm.
By the way, on those three notes, but I do have AJ Dillon on my team. You're
There you
hitting
go.
like all my players on my teams. And by the way, I never consider AJ Dillon a guy that I would put on my bench. He
Mm.
has to start every week in my mind. I just think that you just never know. And I think his worst games are probably like 50, 60 yards and no touchdowns. Now maybe 80 yards, but that he's going to get so many touches that I just think it's of course when you're sharing the load though with Jones, and he's so good. It is what it is. But you understand he's not number one. Davis Mills. I think that we're only 2 games into this season, but it now looks like Houston understands that they need to find a quarterback. I didn't
Mhm.
mind that they were going to give him an extra year and they had other issues to deal with, but there are going to be a couple of really good quarterbacks you're going to be able to land next year. It looks like Davis Mills, because after getting off to a good start week one, he just tanked. It choked away that game against the Colts. Just looked awful in the second half. Didn't look much better against Denver. And then finally, speaking of Denver, that is another team. As we close out here, would you be giving away? Would you be looking if you had, Sutton or Judy? Maybe those running backs, but definitely Judy. Let's say, would you be looking to field offers?
I never consider anybody untouchable. I would certainly field offers. I think the injury makes it tough to know what to do with Judy right now. Sutton's always going to be somebody that somebody else likes better than I do, so I won't have him in many places. And if I do, I'm willing to move him. I'm not ready to give up on Russell Wilson yet, and I really don't want to. I want to believe that he's ready to rebound, but just everything in Denver right now doesn't scream like here comes a bounce back. It definitely looks like maybe Nathaniel Hackett wasn't ready for this, and it's going to trickle down and affect everything. I hope that Russell Wilson's still good enough to bring things back, and when everybody's healthy and once everybody settles in, they're at least fine. So it's not fire sale for me, but there's nobody untouchable for sure.
All right, Matt. So again, looking forward to talking to you again in a couple of weeks. Jared will be back next week. This season is going to fly by because it always does, unfortunately. How are your teams doing? How many do you have? Like 40?
I have 14 that I am actively managing and
14.
plenty more best balls in play.
And how are you doing so far? It's too early
I'm
to
doing
tell.
I'm doing pretty well so far. I'm a bad record keeper, so if you ask me at any point, I can't say, "Oh, this is exactly how I went last week." I know a lot of people are like, "Oh, my record was 11-3 last week." I'm like, "I don't know. I checked on this team, it did fine. Checked on
Well,
that team, it did fine." And then my kids called me. I had to go do something else.
that's when you have 14 teams, I could imagine. So, Matt, appreciate it. You have the show on YouTube, so that's every day, correct?
Not every day.
Not
In
every day.
season, we're on Monday, we're on Thursday, and we're on Friday for
Okay.
DFS.
So, is it every day before the season?
No,
Oh,
we're
okay.
we're multiple times a week throughout, fantasy football prep time, and then back in those winter months, we're far more infrequent. But yeah, from basically July on, you can find us there multiple times a week.
So Monday is really your who's on the waiver wire kind of show. Wednesday is what?
So yeah, Monday we do a full recap of the Sunday games. Thursday, Jared and I do a full preview of the upcoming week, where we hit every single game, talk about any guy that's at least a question. We might not say much about Jonathan Taylor, but we'll talk about Naheem Hines. And then Friday we're talking DFS on FanDuel and on DraftKings.
Awesome. Matt, appreciate it. Look forward to talking in a couple of weeks. Best of luck. And do you have a game tonight? You have who's your favorite team?
I am an Eagles fan, but my
Oh,
favorite team are my fantasy teams.
yeah, I could imagine. Eagle. Were you from Philly?
I became a fan of the Eagles when just before it was 93. It was Randall Cunningham time. That was a fun Eagles team. It was a really easy team to become a fan of. And I was 13 at the time. So it's even
Is
easier
that Buddy
to become
Ryan?
a fan of that team. So that,
Is that Buddy Ryan?
oh yeah. Yep.
Okay.
Buddy Ryan days. And then we moved to Philadelphia just a couple years after that. So that
Oh,
just
that sealed
solidified
it.
it for
That's
sure.
it. And then
And
they got a
that was
Super
in the
Bowl a couple
range
years
where
ago.
yeah, I was there when Andy Reid became the head coach, and I remember people being like, "Who is this quarterbacks coach from Green Bay? You kidding me?" I was like, "I don't know. Did you see the binder that the guy had at his press conference? I think we at least give this guy a chance and see what happens." That was a fun time as well.
Yeah, well, hey, it's always nice to have a Super Bowl though. That's still kind of fresh. So,
For sure.
that's cool. All right, can't wait for my Super Bowl whenever that'll be. We'll talk to you
Fingers
soon. Thanks,
crossed for
Matt.
you.
What's that?
Fingers crossed for you. I
Yeah,
got plenty of
yeah.
Jets fans in the family.
Oh, you do? Okay, yeah. All right. Well, we'll keep that posted. I'll jot that in so when the team actually I won't use the word receipt though. How about that? Yeah.
That's right.
Thanks, Matt.
Yeah, take care, Greg. Thanks.